On today's show.
Once the dealer had told him that he'd never been given a dud check, he thought, oh well, cop this then, here's your first.
This podcast is recommended for listeners over the age of 18 years. It contains content that some may find distressing, including but not limited to themes of death, abuse, violence, murder, self-harm and missing persons.
Welcome to What Are We Looking At? A podcast about the true crime cases of retired Detective Valentine Smith. I'm private investigator Samantha Kiss. Like and subscribe to our channel for exclusive content. Welcome listeners to episode 5 of What Are We Looking At? Okay Val, tell us all about these dud checks.
What we're going to talk about today is a group I'm going to call the Kelly Gang. Not Ned Kelly, of course, in the 80s, not the 1880s, but the 1980s. Now, the Inner Eastern Divisional CIB that I was at back then was a tight professional office with a detective senior sergeant in charge. There were 2 detective sergeants and 5 other detectives. It was a busy division as it took in a large slice of the suburbs, and within its precincts were major shopping centres, factories, residential and university areas, as well as busy railway stations. And it wasn't long before I was into the thick of investigations with some quick and effective arrests forthcoming. There were arrests for burglaries, assaults and thefts were commonplace, with some leaving a memorable mark. But one of the first notable jobs that I had was an investigation into a simple car theft. A number of Melbourne's major car dealers were on the auto strips along the main road. On this particular day, I was called over by the used car manager of one dealership to investigate a suspect car deal that he had. Mm-hmm. And the used car manager told me that a man had called in to trade in a late model Holden on a higher value model. The suspect had taken the newer car after leaving the trade-in. However, the cheque for the balance he had given bounced. I asked to look at the vehicle that was traded in. Now, I'm not a car salesman, but as soon as I inspected the trade-in, I smelled an even bigger rat because the trade-in was immaculate. Mm. And in my opinion, it had been professionally detailed. So this is a classic case of what are we looking at? Mm. Because I also noticed a small number on the top left-hand corner of the windscreen. And I immediately voiced my opinion that the car had come straight out of another car yard somewhere, to which the very embarrassed used car manager agreed. So I went back to my office with the dud checks and began to trace the trade-in. I contacted a previous owner who told me he had sold the car to a car dealer in the western suburbs. So when I contacted the western suburb dealer, I found a similar story, but this time the vehicle left behind was a Tasmanian registered car. So we've got a Tasmanian car dropped onto a dealer in the western suburbs, traded in on a car, which has subsequently been driven across to my side of town and traded in on another car. My inquiries with Tasmania identified the first link in the chain. The suspect, whoever he may be, inquired about a car that was being offered for sale. The suspect wanted to buy the car and asked the dealer if he'd take a cheque. The dealer had been in business for many years and he'd never been given a dud cheque. When I later interviewed the suspect, he told me that once the dealer had told him that he'd never been given a dud cheque, he thought, oh, well, cop this then, here's your first. So the suspect then put the car on the ferry from Tasmania to Melbourne and paid for the trip with another dud cheque. Through the Tasmania police, I now identified my suspect as a well-known Tasmanian villain who often used a stepbrother's details and clothes in order to confuse the police when arrested. The cheques in his possession had been stolen in a burglary on a Launceston business premises. I began to trace the cheques now through the banks. Not only was there the cars, but there was also airfares from Tasmania to Melbourne. He'd come by plane, whilst the car had come by boat. And there was the purchase of hardware, including bolt cutters. One can only guess what he wanted them for. To add to the mess, the car yard in the western suburbs was demanding that I expedite the return of their car from our local dealer. The local dealer had now, of course, changed his mind. I went nuts. I said to the dealer in a few short words that it wasn't my fault that your industry was not able to act decently to each other and so bloody keen to rip off everyone. You'd get played for suckers by some dumb nut from Tasmania. Anyway, I never heard any more from the dealers until I apologised gratefully when I eventually cleaned the whole mess up. My next move was to find out more about the criminal gang. What I learned helped in many ways. After a few days, I was called out to a north suburban police station. The police there had picked up one of the gang members and another man for something and were holding them for me to speak to. Well, these guys were straight out of the movie Deliverance. In my individual discussions with them, one of the two promised me that if I didn't deport him back to Tasmania, he would find out where my car thieving check man was. I took the risk, especially seeing as I had nothing on him at that stage and I was fresh out of go back to Tasmania deportation orders. The next day I received a telephone call from him giving me an address in Sydney for my man. After giving me the information, the guy asked me if he could now stay in Australia. Of course, I consented. This guy was that dumb, he didn't even know that Tasmania was as much a part of Australia as the rest of the country. So now armed with an authority to seek extradition from New South Wales, plus a Sydney address, I contacted Fairfield detectives in Sydney, and it wasn't long before I received a telephone call from a New South Wales detective sergeant that my man was in custody. So within 24 hours, I was on a flight to Sydney to interview him and bring him back to Victoria. Immediately interviewed my wanted man for the Victorian offence. Quantity of property was also recovered in his possession, including the stolen car, the last one. During the interview, I ascertained that my man had used the stolen cheques to purchase all sorts of things, including food, etc., some of which was still in his possession. He also admitted using the bolt cutters to bust padlocks on various businesses up the eastern seaboard. In amongst his goods that he had was an alligator skin suitcase, which was obviously extremely expensive, and some expensive male clothes, as well as some personal identification, including another checkbook in a name that hadn't featured in my inquiries. My crook was initially tight-lipped on the origin of the suitcase, until I quickly established that the owner was in fact an American who was a senior executive with the Ford Motor Car Company. I contacted the executive, who was totally confused, yet impressed with our investigations, because apparently he had last seen the suitcase in San Francisco prior to the long haul by air across the Pacific on his way to Australia. So he'd reported it's lost to the American Airlines as lost in transit before coming to Australia. So here's the question. How did my crook in Sydney end up with a suitcase that's reported lost in San Francisco? He was amazed to learn how it came to be in possession of a Tasmanian criminal arrested in New South Wales. He was equally unimpressed, though, to learn of the fate of his expensive business shirts. The explanation was simple. My criminal had flown into Melbourne from Tasmania about the same time as the American executive. After arriving at Melbourne Airport and walking across the tarmac, as one did in those days, my crook noticed an airport baggage handler's trolley with a pile of luggage on it. He spotted the beautiful alligator skin case on it and merely lifted it off the trolley and kept walking. Later, after leaving by stolen motorcar for Sydney, he checked the contents of the stolen suitcase, and on seeing the business shirts, he threw them and their annoying detachable collars into a waste disposable bin outside, get this, the headquarters of the Ford Motor Company on the Hume Highway at Broadmeadow. This was the very building where at the time the American owner of the shirts was working. How would you wouldn't read about it? The extradition application against my crook was granted and he was remanded in my custody to be escorted back to Melbourne. I lodged him in the Fairfield lockup and set about tidying up the case. And one of my challenges was to get all the stolen property back to Melbourne. So I rang up my boss, he told me to get some boxes, wrap it all up and post it back. Contacted a local overnight freight company for them to do all the work. They turned up with a little van, boxed it all up and gave me a copy of the manifest docket. And I never heard another thing. I don't know who paid for it. That night I went out to dinner with the Fairfield detectives, a local Serbian restaurant where the proprietor educated me on the history of Yugoslavia, which was a most informative and entertaining night. And the next morning I grabbed my crook and took him in handcuffs to the airport. always had my own method of transporting prisoners by air, and it was simple. They'd be handcuffed at all times, and I insisted on a window seat for the prisoner, and that way they'd have to climb over me to escape or cause any grief to other passengers. And I also insisted that we were the first on the aircraft and the last off. My theory on the boarding process was that my prisoner had no time to make a break whilst in a queue or unearth other passengers who might see the handcuffs. The airline staff was very happy with my method of escorting prisoners and told me so. Anyway, within an hour of my arrival back at the office, the courier van turned up with all the stolen property, delivered right to the door, assigned the receipts. Brooke went to prison for a few years. Some days later, I was tidying up the last piece of the paperwork, and I picked up a daily wanted bulletin. I turned it over to look at the other bulletins and noted on the back an hilarious coincidence. On the back of the circular for my crook was a clear photograph of the Tasmanian who I had given permission to stay in Australia. Lo and behold, the Tasmanian police wanted him on an extradition warrant for robbery. So my promise to him about being a resident visa status in Australia were now clearly null and void. So seeing I knew where he was, I rang a mate at the consorting squad to go and pick him up, and the end result was that he was sued off the street and better still out of the state and back in Tasmania. So that was the end of the Kelly gang. Wherever those guys were, they were just a whirling cyclone of crime, those fellows. Hilarious, if you can call villains hilarious.
It's interesting to note how cluey some criminals actually are. It's also an interesting thing to think about how people of status or with wealth often want everyone to know that they have status and wealth. And that's often their downfall. Many cases that I've worked have proven that. So that fellow from America, should he have not had a alligator skin suitcase, then he wouldn't have been a target. If he had have just had an ordinary probably leather suitcase back then, just like everyone else, brown or black, then he wouldn't have been singled out. It's almost a comedy skit, isn't it? Sometimes these criminals and how they find opportunity and then how they take said opportunity.
Yeah, you're right, Sam. As far as some criminals are concerned, and these ones are classic, they're very quick-witted. They know how to work the system. And this fellow's suitcase was obviously picked out. There would have been, 20, 30, 50 suitcases on that trolley, and that one boomed out, pick me on it. And that's why this guy picked it. There was another fellow that arrested some time later where he and his mate would dress up, present themselves as being sort of well off, and they were check offenders as well, and they'd walk into a car yard and buy 2 cars with stolen checks. And they'd be judged purely on the way they presented themselves, and they're criminals.
The idea of fraud and how much that has changed in the last few decades at least, where, often we think that the digitalisation of the world has made finding crims easier, but it's not necessarily the case. People are constantly being scammed, and the scammers have got such a refined art now. A connection of mine got scammed by an email that was sent supposedly from the ATO. Even with my understanding, my skill level, it was even hard to determine that it was a scam. It was only because I looked at the reply to email address that I could tell that it wasn't from the ATO. But everything else about it really represented as though it was. And it just makes you wonder, is it actually easier to spot fraud with all of our fancy digitalisation? Or was it easier back then in some ways because people knew one another and it was all done person to person? Not much of that stuff was done over the phone.
I think back then there was a conflict between the natural sense of trusting people, which was a legacy of the past, and the problems with not allowing things like checks to clear before parting with the goods. Whereas nowadays, you're right, it's a lot more complicated with scams, and some of them are quite sophisticated in the way they present themselves. Again, use that thought process of what am I looking at here? Take your time, look at it. Who's sending this? Why are they sending it to me? What do they want me to do? Tap on the sender and you'll see it come from some ridiculous sender from somewhere else. And it's nonsense. It's rubbish. You just got to slow down and take time.
And I suppose opportunistic criminals play the same game as they always have done, and that is that they target vulnerable people or vulnerable situations.
That's right, and they take the advantage of catching us at a moment when we are distracted, when we're busy,
So moral to the story, peeps, don't be so busy.
That's right.
If you or someone you know has found this content distressing and needs support, please contact Lifeline, Beyond Blue, or the Suicide Callback Service. For more information about who we are and what we do, please visit www.missingинaustralia.com.au. Till next time.